Welcome. In the last video, we looked at the HTML side of forms. Now, we're going to turn our attention to working with the DOM and the JavaScript side of working with forms. The first thing to know is that we have a few different ways of selecting forms on a page using JavaScript in the DOM. The first, although not the most common, is to use document.forms. This will return an array of all of the forms on the page. More commonly, if you have an ID of your form, you could use Okay, so I mentioned earlier that we could kind of loop through these like it's an array. So I have here the main form, which I'm getting the same way we saw before. However, now instead of looping through it, I'm going to say, give me the first item in that array, or give me the first item in that field, or give me the first item in that form. So what that's going to do is give us that first hidden input field. And I've never quite understood this, but if you refresh, you often get two different conditions here. You could see it printed out in this way with all of its properties, as well as the actual field selected itself here. And so this is our input field. And if we change this, let's say we wanted the fifth item, which we would get by 4, notice that that's going to be our text area. We have the hidden one, we have our field set, we have our name, the subject, and then the text area here, and that will give us our text area. So this is another method that we have. Rather than letting the loop set the value for us, we're just going to hard code what we want. However, the problem here is that if you use this approach, you may get the wrong thing if that field changes. So it could change dynamically, or somebody could update the field, move things around, change the order in the source code, and then your JavaScript won't be giving you exactly what you want. So for this reason, we have some more specific ways to select form field items, and we'll look at that next. So now we see an example that is a little bit more common. We have getElementById giving us just one main form. We're using getElementById, the full name, to give us the full name up here. Notice that if we were to select this, we could see that it has an ID set right here. So we're using that to grab it. And then I'm just demonstrating that you could use all of the stuff that we've seen before. You could use query selector to get our select field. This is going to be our subject. And we could use getElementsByName, which we just learned about. However, because this is an array, we also have to make sure that we're selecting which value in this, because there's only one item in this array for message. Again, if we come down to message, we could see this has a name set of message. So we're using that here, but because it returns an array, we're saying only give us the first value. And then we could also use something like the getElementsByName here for our contact preferences. Now our contact preferences, if I select these, remember that actually it's going to be a little bit easier. I'll do it in the source code over here. So notice that we have our contact preferences, and both the email one and the phone one have the same name. Both of their names are contact preference, because only one of these is going to be selected and submitted. So we wouldn't actually get two name contact preferences on the back end. We'd only get one, but on the front end, they both have the same name. So for this reason, if we wanted to select all of the contact preferences and do something with them, we're going to get a full array back here. And if we just log this out, again, I'm using the method console log with comma separated. Each of these could be their own console log. However, I could do it this way as well. And because of how white space works in JavaScript, if we're passing parameters and we use a comma to separate them, we could also put in line breaks just to make it a little bit cleaner. But again, this is going to be the same thing as had I written them out all on one line. It just, all in one line. It just makes it a little bit easier to see this way, spread out onto multiple lines, I think. So what happens here when we log these out is that we get our input field, we get our select field, our text area, but then we get, as the last one, we get an array, because it's going to give us both of these values because they share a common name. And we'll look more when we get into getting and setting the actual values, why this is and why this can be helpful for us. However, at this point, you should have a pretty good grasp of different ways you could go about selecting not just the form itself, but different elements within it. We can approach it like an array, we could use a loop, we could grab specific indexes, and we could use any of these other elements that we've seen before, or any of these other methods that we've seen before, getElementById, query selector, getElementsByName, etc. So now that we've looked at how to get the actual elements themselves, let's look at how to get their values. The simplest way to get the value of a form element is to use the value property. We discussed this in the past, and now we could take a quick look at how this works in our JavaScript. So what I have here is the main form itself, and then because this main form sort of works like an array and we can get the length of all the form elements, I set up a basic for loop. And what I'm going to log out here is each element in the array, I'm going to get its name, which again is the name attribute, and I'm going to get its value. So let's go ahead and log this. And notice that we have secret and then the value of it. We have undefined because this was actually our field set. And remember how I mentioned before, if you loop through an entire form and all of its values, you may have to do different things with different elements. For example, we're getting undefined here, so we'd want in our loop a way to throw this out if it So before we look at our next example, I want to show you just how easy it is to set a new value for a form element. All we would do is simply get the form element we want, use the value property, and then assign a new value. It's as simple as that. However, what I mentioned before is we might not always want the value attribute, we might want something else. So let's look at another example to solidify this a bit and go into more depth. Okay, what we have in our example here is we're basically getting our form, we're getting our full name, and then we're going to get the first item, or actually the second item here, because of the 0 index. 0 is the first item, 1 is the second item of our phone preference, or our contact preference is actually what we're grabbing. We want to get the second item here. So what I do is to change the value using JavaScript, I simply select the element, What I want to mention in closing here is that the DOM remembers both the default or the original value as well as the current value of a form element. And this can be quite helpful for us. So let's take a look at how this works. Let's start off by opening up our console and selecting our input field. So actually this isn't console anymore, I'm in the element. I use the element selector here and I selected my input field. And then I'm going to go full screen for a moment here. And what I want to point out is that if we come over to properties and into our input field, scroll down to D, notice that we see default checked. Make this a little bit bigger for you. Oh, a little too big. We see default checked and default value. So what this tells us is that the DOM and JavaScript, well, the DOM is going to remember the original hard-coded or the original value when the page loaded. And this may be different than the checked value. So there is a checked value, true. This is what we were modifying before. And then if we scroll all the way down to V, there's going to be a value. And these two may not be the same. So let's make this smaller again. And now let me uncomment out this and we'll walk through this briefly, what's going on here. So what I'm doing is I'm selecting the newsletter sign up by saying get elements by name, and then, just like we saw before, not going to explain it anymore. And then I'm going to log out this whole element. So I log it out and I've got my input element. Notice that, like I said before, it will have our default values and then it will have the full values. Nothing really special there. Then I'm going to log out the default checked value, and I do that by using the default checked property, just like we saw there in the inspector. And this is going to tell us that originally this was true. And if we scroll down or scroll up here, our newsletter, we set it equal to checked. So by default, it's going to be checked. That's cool. And then we're going to say, what is the checked value? And that is also going to be equal to true. Now what we do is we change this value. So here we're just logging it out. We're not changing the value. We're just saying, what is this property? Log it out. However, on this line, we're saying set the checked value equal to false. So when we look at it in the page, notice it's no longer checked. Now we're going to write the same code. We're going to say, okay, what was the default checked equal to originally? It was originally set to true. However, what's the current value of it? Oh, the current value is set to false. So it may be reaching a little bit to say that this can help you with security, because there are ways to modify things and you want to do multiple levels of verification and validation. However, it is very important to know that the DOM and JavaScript can have access to what the original value was when it loaded, as well as the most current value. However, what it does not have is every changed value in between. So if I start changing this like this, on, off, on, off, on, off, I don't have access to every single instance of that. What we'll look at later on in this course as we get more advanced is how to begin keeping a record of everything that happens. However, this could get quite expensive memory-wise if we don't do it the right way, so there are some tools that help us with this. But in general, by default, we do have access to both the default value, or the original one, as well as the current state. So we have looked at a lot in this video here, and like I said at the beginning of part 1 of this video, working with forms is one of the largest parts of working with JavaScript. Of course, we have our animation and a lot of other stuff we could do, but working with forms is an essential part of it. So the first thing we looked at is that we have multiple ways to select a form. We could use document.form, we could use getElementsByName, we could use getElementByID, query selector, any of these ones we've looked at in the past. And the same thing goes for selecting form elements. We could treat the form like an array and we could loop through it. We could say, give me the first, second, or third value in the form. And then we could use the same things we've seen of getElementByID, getElementsByName, query selector, any of that stuff to get specific elements. Then we looked at with the input fields as well as the text area. This works the same way. We didn't actually look at this specifically, but it works the exact same way, is that we could use the value property, and we could use the value property to get the value, and we could use the value property to set the value. Then we went one step further and we looked at different types of fields, the radio buttons, the check boxes, the select boxes or select fields. How can we set these to be select or checked? Now, what we didn't look at here is how we can change and modify all of the other attributes, but this is the exact same as what we've looked at in past videos. This is not any different for forms. So if you wanted to modify any of these different attributes, you could do so using get attribute, set attribute, that sort of thing. Then we also talked about default and current values, how we could use default checked or default value, as well as the current value, or checked, or any of those. And this could be helpful if you ever wanted to figure out what it was when it first loaded and then what is it now. But like I said, you do not get a full array of every single change that's happened to that. And we'll look later on in this course at how we could kind of reproduce that or create that ourselves if we really needed to. And finally, I mentioned a little aside on hacking fields and how, doing something like changing a read-only field, you could change the value, you could change it from read-only to not read-only. And at this point, what I want to really encourage you is do not go forward without building a form and start messing with all this stuff. Play around with how to set fields, values, play around with how to check things off. And in fact, you really shouldn't proceed until you've built a form from scratch and you've filled out the form just using JavaScript. So you put in your name, you change the text value, play around with selecting elements. Like our example one, build out your own form and go through and try to modify every single possible attribute or value or checked state or selected state that you can. The more comfortable you become with this, the better. And then the ultimate test is going to be go to somebody else's form and try to fill out that sucker with JavaScript. Of course, you're not going to really want to do this. This is the reason we have a mouse and other select elements and a keyboard, but try it. Go to somebody else's form, try to grab all the elements you need and modify them on the fly just in the console. This is a really helpful thing to know, and it's really going to solidify all the stuff that you've learned so far. So after you've done that, then come back and we'll go into the next video on how we could begin styling things in the nodes. And we have a number of different ways to do this and figure out what the initial style was and set a new custom style, override it, and we'll get all of that going in the next video. But first, make sure you go and play around with this, practice on your own before proceeding.